Beginning today, we are starting something new here at United. Once a week, we're going to be putting out an additional sermon. It's going to be on the Old Testament. We're going to start in the book of Genesis and travel forward. And the hope is twofold. First, to give you just a rough outline of the Old Testament. And if you listen to these sermons and they are edifying or uplifting to you, they've served their purpose. But the larger goal, the bigger hope, is that you would take these sermons and join together with some others, having listened to them and using some of the resources we're providing in the links below, and do a little Bible study conversation group so you can figure out how this story of God's Word applies to your life. And so the first story we're going to cover today is really the Genesis 1 and 2, the creation stories pulled together. And I think the point of those stories that I like to impress upon you, obviously there's lots of stuff there, but the important thing I want to impress upon you is this: what we are called matters. Let me give you an illustration. There was a traveling preacher from years ago who told the story of the first time he did a hospital visit. You have to understand, this was actually his first day of being a pastor. He had shown up in this little country church. He had met a few people from the congregation. They had helped him move into the parsonage, but for the most part, he had no idea what to expect. He shows up his first day. They've given him a key. He unlocks the church. He turns on the lights, and he just stands around to waiting to meet people. They walk in. People shake his hand. It feels like the service actually unfolds pretty well. He uses the sermon illustrations he had at seminary that were funny and uplifting. And by the time the service was over, he thought, you know what, I've had a pretty good first day. This was a good first impression. So he goes to the back of the church and he's shaking people's hands. And everyone welcomes him and everyone says, we're glad you are with us. But he notices there's like a group of 5 or 6 people who are just waiting in the back. It's like they want to tell him something, but they don't want to do this in front of others. So he kind of braces himself. He anticipates the worst. And finally, an older farmer comes to him, takes him by the hand and says, welcome, Pastor. We're so thankful you're with us. He introduces himself. And then he says, I don't know if you know this, but the oldest member of our congregation was just hospitalized. Would you be able to go visit her in the hospital? He said, oh, of course I would. In fact, I can go this afternoon. I'll be there in an hour. I can be there. He gets her name. He knows which hospital it is. And before the farmer leaves, he just shakes his hand one more time and says, you know, some people might say she's a piece of work. Pastor thinks, well, that's an odd thing to say about your sister in Christ. He says goodbye to the farmer, and then there's a couple that comes out. They're in their 50s. They chat for a little bit, and then they say, you know, Pastor, I don't know if anybody's told you, but our neighbor, they reference this same woman, she was hospitalized a couple days ago, and I know where she's at. I got her name. In fact, I know the room number. I'm going to go visit her this afternoon. To which they say, oh, that's fantastic. You know, Pastor, she can be a little difficult. And then they walk out. And finally, a third couple comes and he talks to the wife. The husband doesn't say anything the whole time, just stands there, kind of a smile on his face, nodding along. And she says, again, same thing. There's an older member of our congregation. Yep, I know. I'm going to go visit her as soon as service is over. Well, she's a little persnickety, just so you know. He's never even heard that expression. He doesn't know what it means. She walks by, and finally the husband speaks for the first time, and he simply whispers, don't mention her late husband. Okay, the man says. And this is what happens. There's 2 more people that line up basically to tell him the same thing, that there's this person that he needs to visit, but by the time he's collected all of these little hints, he's expecting the worst, right? He goes to this hospital. He walks into the room and he takes a deep breath before he goes inside, and most of the time what pastors are thinking, especially early on, is what do I do in this situation? When do I pray? If the person cries, do I hold the person's hand? Do I offer Kleenex? What am I supposed to do? What's appropriate? But in this case, he's not even thinking about those things. He's thinking he's walking into this like fire-breathing dragon who's going to devour him after all the things these people in this congregation have told him. So he walks in, and much to his amazement, he sees her. And she's this tiny little woman. She's like 5'2". She's just all skin and bones. She's frail looking. She's in her upper 80s, he thinks, and He goes over, and before he can even say anything, he's thinking, I've got to preach some sermons about being judgmental and about respecting our elders, because clearly the people have not shown this poor woman any sort of respect. So he walks right up to her and he calls her by name. He says, Beulah, I'm pastor. And she says, oh, wow. So you're the new guy. Wow. You really are young. I bet you're barely out of high school. And she doesn't say it in a joking manner. It's in an attacking manner. He takes it as a joke nonetheless. He tries to shake it off. Yeah, I assure you, I've gone to seminary. This is my first call. I'm just very happy to be with you and with the congregation. Oh, you're one of those young pastors. Think you know everything, don't you? You're going to come in and change everything. Next thing you know, you're going to be telling us we got to raise our hands in the air when we're singing. And you're probably going to tell me I got to roll in the aisle when I'm in the middle of church. Well, I won't do it. And immediately he's obviously he's taken aback, but he's dealt with difficult people before. So he takes a deep breath and he puts on his most winsome smile and he says, Beulah, I'm not like some of those other young pastors who are always wanting to change everything. I really respect the traditions of the church. And I think your congregation has this deep history, and I want to really learn from the history. Oh, she says, before he can even finish, you're one of those guys, just like the last one, huh? Same thing every week, same old, never anything new. I know the type. And it continues. For the next 10, 12 minutes, the conversation is like that. He says one thing, and she just kills him for it, and he says, well, no, I'm not that. And then she assumes the worst on the other side, and it's miserable. It's for 10 or 12 minutes. I mean, by the time she is done just eviscerating him, he's wondering, I should have sold insurance or been a teacher or done something else. Why in the world did I choose to be a pastor? At which point he knows he's got two choices. The obvious choice is to say, well, Beulah, it's been awesome meeting you. I have lots of other people I got to go see. Do you mind if I say a prayer real quick? And then he can run out of the hospital as fast as he possibly can. Or perhaps he could get her to change the subject, to talk about something that makes her happy. Of course, he was warned, don't talk about her late husband. Don't go there, Pastor. So instead, for reasons he couldn't describe, he said, Beulah, tell me about your parents. What were they like? Well, what do you want to know about them for? And then for reasons he couldn't explain, she started talking. It was a horrific story. Beulah's mother had died shortly after giving birth to Beulah. Her father, she had a few memories of him, but had also died when she was very young. Her and her older two sisters were raised by an aunt who cared for them and loved them, but you could tell there was something missing in her life. And when he asked about her sisters, this look of anger, bitterness just consumed her. Beulah talked about her sisters, Mary and Angela. Mary was like a princess and Angela was like a queen. They were both beautiful and radiant. And even when she said their names, there was like this sarcastic tone to them. And suddenly the pastor started to realize what it was. Yeah, when Beulah talked to me, he would say, oh yeah, Mary was named after Mary, the mother of Jesus. This is a very religious family. Beautiful Mary, she would say in kind of a biting tone. And Angela was named after the angels, the radiant angels, the radiant Angela, she would call her sister. There's so much bitterness there. And she would say the names like this. There was Mary, and there was Angela, and then there was Beulah. And she said her own name with this disgust. And the pastor realized in the midst of this is a woman for a variety of reasons, all right? He wasn't a psychiatrist. He didn't go this deep. He didn't know what it was exactly. Maybe it was this unfounded guilt over losing her mother the way she did. Maybe it was because she missed her father so much, or there was something missing in the family she was raised in. Maybe it was because her sisters teased her like older sisters did, but she had grown up believing that that's exactly how her father and her mother had said her name. that they had taken one look at Mary, her sister, and said, "Oh, Mary." And they had taken one look at Angela and said, "Oh, Angela, isn't she beautiful?" And they had taken one look at Beulah and said, "Beulah." What we are called matters. Years ago, when I was living in Dodge Center, I got called to referee a 4th grade basketball tournament. And so I showed up to help out, and I still remember, while the day was fun, and I remember even joking with some of the other officials, there was this one moment. I was refereeing a game of 2 teams from different communities, not from Dodge Center, and there was, it's 4th grade basketball. The kids barely even know how to dribble, let alone tie their shoes. I mean, it's like herding cats up and down the court. And yet there was this one dad, and he just kept yelling. And he was yelling at not all the kids, he was yelling at just his own son. He was yelling every time the kid would touch the basketball, "Shoot it, shoot it." And every time he would run up and down the court, his dad would be yelling, "Run faster, run faster." And when the ball would roll, he would yell, even if his son was like 15 feet away, "Get on the floor, get on the floor." And it was just this, so much intensity. And while the dad didn't know he was doing this, I'm sure he was just caught up in the moment. I watched that kid's face throughout the game. And I knew what that son was hearing. Every time his dad said, "Shoot it," what the kid was hearing was, "You're not good enough. You're not good enough." Every time he said, "Run faster," he was being told, "You're not good enough. You're not good enough." Every time he heard his father yell, "Get on the floor," it was, "You're not good enough. You're not good enough." And by the time that little boy, who was probably playing his first or second basketball game ever, it's like he had shrunk 3 inches. His head was down, his shoulders were slumped. He walked in that game with all these expectations, and when time it was done, that big smile he had on his face, which all the boys had at the beginning, it was gone. And he walked out of that gym feeling like he wasn't good enough. That became his identity. Of course, it's not just overzealous dads who do this to kids playing sports, right? So many of us are in situations where we hear those voices. For some people, it's in a relationship, which no matter what you do or what you say, you feel like you're not good enough. For other people, it's a job, or you walk into a classroom and no matter how hard you try, you feel like nothing ever measures up, nothing ever is good enough. That's why the story of Genesis is so very, very important. If I said Adam and Eve to you, what's that part of the story you think of? Well, most people would say, well, the serpent eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, disobeying God, hiding from God. People think about all those types of aspects of the story, and they're there, and they are important to be sure. But the most important part of that story in Genesis 1 and 2 is the part where God forms humanity and breathes life into them and says, "This is your identity." Do you know what God says when humanity is formed? God says, "You are very good." Think about what that means. God looks at the Grand Canyon and says, "It's good." God looks at Mount Everest and says, it's good. God looks at the depths of the ocean. God takes a peek at the boundary waters. God looks at any place in creation, the most beautiful, most inspiring, most place that leaves you in awe. And God says, "Yeah, it's good." But when God looks at you on your worst day, when you've got toothpaste stuck in one corner of your mouth and a little bit of drool in the other, God looks at you on your worst hair day you can imagine. God looks at you when you've got that hair growing out of your ear and you have no idea how it got there. God says, "You are very good." And friends, that matters. It matters because we live in a world where sometimes you will go through and you will hear lots of things. You'll hear those voices telling you over and over again, "You're not good enough. You're not good enough." And it's easy to take on that identity and allow that identity to make us bitter, to make us selfish, to make us angry people, to turn us in on ourselves. Instead, we need to listen to the voice who tells us, "You're very good." In the eyes of the one who matters most, in the eyes of the one who created you, You are very good, and what we are called matters. And if you don't believe me, believe Beulah. Back in the hospital room, the pastor had this enlightening moment. Finally, after about 15 more minutes of conversation, he was there for about a half an hour, and the conversation was going awful. He finally said, Beulah, when you mentioned your father, you said he was a professor. What did he teach? Well, he was an English professor in literature. He taught at the college where they were living, and he got a smile on his face. And he said, well, I suppose you probably already know where your name comes from. And for the first time, this angry, bitter woman paused. It was almost like she was afraid to hear what he had to say. And she said, no. He said, Beulah there's an old poem that uses the word Beulah. It would have come out, it would have been around when your dad was teaching. It was this famous poem, and I don't even remember. I'd like to be able to recite the poem to you, but it was about the person talking about the love of his life, and he uses the term Beulah to describe someone who's so beautiful, so radiant, he can't find the words to describe his love for her. And as she heard this, suddenly she got tears in her eyes. And it was like, from the pastor's perspective, suddenly she was looking back at her entire life. And she realized she had been wrong. When her father had looked at her, when her mother had looked at her for the first time, they had not said, oh, she's Beulah. They had looked at her as someone who was radiant and beautiful, someone who was so surrounded by love they couldn't even find the words, and so they had called their daughter Beulah. And suddenly that pastor saw something that other people in the congregation who had been going there for decades had only heard rumors of. He saw Beulah smile. Dear friends, what we are called matters. Know this on your best day and on your worst day, regardless of whatever else other voices you may be hearing in the world around you. Know this, the maker of heaven and earth looks at you and says, you aren't just good. In my eyes, you are very good. Amen.